Brazil normally is not an early mover when it comes to those things. We saw that in solar, we saw that in wind, and we're seeing it now in storage. But when the market happens, it takes off very, very quickly. In solar, for example, Brazil within 5 years went from 0 to more than 30 gigawatts installed capacity. I have no doubts that will be happening in storage as well. Chile we're already kind of seeing that inflection point happening.
Welcome to the Smarter E podcast special, a 6-part miniseries recorded live at the Smarter E Europe, which took place in June in Munich. Having visitors from all over the world flocking to Munich to visit the Intersolar, the EES, Power to Drive, and EM Power, we used the opportunity to sit down with some of them and dive deeper into some of the major current topics. Enjoy! Well, it's the first day of the Smarter E Europe 2023, and I have the pleasure of sitting down with Markus Vlasits, CEO of NewCharge, for the third episode of our mini-series. Markus is the managing director of NewCharge. He has a long history in the photovoltaic sector. He was vice president of Q-Cells in Germany, executive director of Yingli Green Energy of Brazil, and co-founder and commercial director of Faro Energy. And most importantly, he's an absolute Brazil expert, and that's exactly what we'll make use of, because we'll be talking about Brazil in this episode. Ever since the change of government a few months ago, the energy transition has been playing a significant role again for the country. Of course, for us, from a European perspective, Brazil is very interesting as a raw material supplier for green hydrogen for Europe. But there are also exciting local applications. Brazil, for example, is the world's largest importer of fertilizers, and its most important supplier is Russia. Green hydrogen could be used as feedstock for local fertilizer production, reducing dependence on imports. Another topic might be energy storage systems. They're also becoming increasingly important. The development of these in South America is still in its infancy. However, in Chile, there are already the first large-scale projects in which large-scale storage facilities are coupled to solar and wind power plants, similar as you know it from California. So all of these things we'll be touching upon. Welcome, Markus.
Good morning in this beautiful morning in Munich. Sunny springtime, that's great, and thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Let's just cut right to the chase. Of course, from a European perspective, as I mentioned, it's super interesting to look at Brazil as a raw material supplier. But if we take that question back for a moment, are there any other additional business opportunities beyond that?
No, absolutely. And as you rightly mentioned, there's a variety really of opportunities for satisfying local demand. We definitely should be talking about fertilizers in the case of Brazil. There are also, very interesting other opportunities of green hydrogen. If you think of the transportation sector, if you think of heavy industry and all those kind of things. And if we look into energy storage, that by definition is a local application. So we definitely should be talking more about those projects in Chile, which you referred to. I think we should also be talking about off-grid systems, especially in the Amazon region, which today generates most of its electricity by burning fuel, diesel basically. So when we talk about storage, definitely we are talking about serving the local market and finding applications that add value locally.
Let's dive into all of these topics, but let's break them down bit by bit. Let's focus on the fertilizers. Of course, becoming independent from Russia is currently a very European top priority. I don't know if it's such a priority for Brazil, actually. So are there any concrete plans to use green hydrogen as feedstock for local fertilizer production?
There are. And just to put things a little bit into perspective, when we talk about fertilizer importation, we are talking about something like 40 million tons per year, 15 billion US dollars. And so this is a huge business. And as you rightfully said, Russia together with Canada and Belarus are the main suppliers of fertilizers. And there are a couple of projects which are being prepared. There's one, for example, which already has been announced, which is a facility in the state of Minas, which will produce something around 500,000 tons per year. So it's roughly 1% of domestic demand. It's the first step,
I'm sorry, 500,000 tons are 1% of the domestic.
That is correct.
Oh my God, those are really big numbers you're dealing with.
We are talking about one of the world's largest producers of agricultural commodities, really. And especially for soybean production, you need a lot of fertilizers. And I agree with you, the numbers are really amazing. So we're talking about 500,000 tons per year with an average energy consumption of 300 megawatts. So if we want to do this with solar, we are talking about a dedicated plant of 1.2, 1.3 gigawatts of solar capacity. So it's big stuff. It's big stuff. And it is a project that has been announced publicly by a local company called Atlas Agro. And they plan to start construction on this plant next year in 24. It should go online in 27. And they are planning to do 7, 8 more of those plants. So things in Brazil, things are happening, but it's a medium long-term perspective also.
I was just going to ask about that 1%. It's a start.
It's a start, really.
Every first step counts, but are there any projections to how we will get from 1 maybe to 10% or even more?
Well, there are projections, but we are really talking about a 10 to 15-year time frame.
All right. So we got that covered. Let's talk about storage. Energy storage is still in its early stages of development in all of South America, basically. So maybe you can give us an update on more like the lighthouse projects that are setting an example.
Absolutely. And when we talk about large-scale energy storage today in South America, we really need to go to Chile, right? If you remember, Chile some 10, 15 years ago was at the forefront of solar deployment, the first kind of large scale. Today they are mini scale, but at that time large scale solar plants happened in Chile, and now we see the same story repeating itself with energy storage as well. Chile did a couple of smaller projects 10, 15 years ago, then it kind of fell into dormancy, and now we really see a push again for larger projects. So there is one project that is actually, being prepared for implementation, which is IS Andes Solar 2B, more specifically. And that project is located in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, which is probably the best place on this planet in terms of solar irradiation. So we're talking about a solar facility of 180 megawatt peak, a energy storage system with 560 megawatt hours. And from what I have heard, this is a project which is going to be CC coupled, which means that you put the batteries and the solar panels at the same part, basically at the CC part of the plant, which is interesting in terms of efficiency.
Just a very stupid question now, but how do you cool those batteries in the Atacama Desert?
Great question. Lithium-ion batteries don't like to be heated up. And what we see in the industry as a trend is really the adoption of liquid cooling. So you have a liquid coolant, which is typically, a mixture of glycol and some other stuff. And that allows you to do a kind of a precision cooling of all those cells. And, it's an important issue, but it is something where we can learn actually from electric mobility, because battery cooling in cars is even more important. And so there's definitely a technical solution to that.
And do you know what kind of communities or industries this project will be supplying?
So this project will be selling to the wholesale markets, and the purpose of the batteries is really to shift a significant part really of the energy from the kind of daytime hours, what they call B block in Chile, into the peak hours in the evening especially. So it's kind of a time shift function, which clearly enhances the revenues of the project, but is also beneficial to the electric load overall, because basically, once you have those high penetrations of solar, same thing that we're seeing in California, for example, then you have actually surplus power during the early afternoon, and you lack power in the evening. So, doing this shift from the afternoon into the evening or into the early morning, whatever you need, clearly is beneficial also from a system management level. So Chile has a couple of large projects also other than Andes Solar 2B. There is stuff in the central and southern part of the country where energy storage is being coupled to wind generation. And in Brazil, there is also quite an interesting project which is very different, and this is transmission relief. So this is a project which has been installed in one of the large substations in the state of São Paulo, in Registro. It's a 30 megawatt, 60 megawatt hour project. And what it really does is to avoid grid congestion, especially during the holiday season. So what you have to kind of figure out, you have the greater São Paulo area with 20 million inhabitants. and not so small portion of those love going to the sea during holiday time. So you have this spike. Not only have tremendous traffic jams, but you get those spikes in energy consumption during Carnival, Christmas, etc. And so what this project really does is provide peak power at critical moments during those times. And typically we're talking about 2 to 3 hours, but it makes all the difference.
So those are really interesting and large projects, meaning they're also tied into the national grid.
Yes.
So if we look at the off-grid sector specifically, what kind of role does energy storage play there?
This is a great question because off-grid often gets overlooked, but I believe that in South America and especially in Brazil, it is really an important and worthwhile application. When we look into the Amazon region of Brazil, we are talking about 150 municipalities which have not been interconnected yet. And a significant proportional part of those, they are so remote that connecting them to the national electricity grid doesn't make a lot of sense. So today, and we're talking about 3 million people more or less. And so today, these guys get their electricity from fossil fuels, mostly diesel. So you have all those, it's every year it's millions of liters of diesel that has been being shipped up and down the rivers in the Amazon region. And so if we look into alternatives, then we need some sort of renewable source. There are some locations where we have biomass, which is great, but in many locations it's really solar. And when you look into solar in an off-grid setting, you obviously need something to make this intermittent source, to turn it into a dispatchable source. And this is when we come where we really need batteries. And so the purpose really is, improve quality of supply, lower costs, and obviously, reduce greenhouse gas emissions coming from those projects.
I just wanted to follow up on that because, of course, we all need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But if I'm like a farmer in the midst of the Amazon working on a really minimal wage, how much capacity do I really have to worry about that issue? So what are additional benefits in swapping a storage system for a diesel generator, or the other way around?
Exactly, hopefully the other way around.
Yeah.
So look, generating electricity through diesel really is expensive, right? And it's not only the cost of the fuel per se, it's also the logistics cost. When we're talking about those remote locations, we are talking that, to get 1 liter of diesel to your point of consumption, you might have to burn another liter to get the fuel there. So really cost is a significant driver. And logistics is also a huge driver. For example, you do have quite significant fluctuations in water levels in those rivers, which means that many of those places of these towns are not actually accessible by boat during 3 or 4 months per year, which means you have to, create huge stocks of fuel. You have the issue of theft. So there is really, a very complex logistics chain of fuel that can actually be avoided when we go with solar and with storage. And also what is interesting is in Brazil, there are specific energy auctions for those towns. So basically, federal government runs an auction every 2 to 3 years. The next one is expected for late 23, early 24. And you can, bid for a 5 to 15 year PPA, and then, your company will be given town XYZ, and you will be basically supplying power to that town for that period. So that's quite an efficient scheme for contracting power. And one of the things that we are, discussing with the government and with the Ministry of Mines and Energy is to alter the rules of those auctions so that renewable power, and specifically solar and batteries, really can participate. And I'm quite optimistic that will happen, actually.
Speaking about auctions, who actually is supplying the components and the technology? Like, who's benefiting from the market?
Great question. So if you look into renewables as a whole in South America, I would say for wind power, there is quite a local, manufacturing footprint. And that makes sense if you just look at the sheer size of the components that have to be produced and shipped around. Both for solar and for storage, the key components, i.e. the batteries, the solar panels, more often than not come from abroad. And more often than not, they come from China. Brazil has become one of the largest markets for the Chinese solar industry, and I think we'll see the same story again for storage. You do have quite a robust domestic supply for, let's say, generic electrical equipment like transformers, substations, and all those kind of things. So it's really a mix, but the key components still come from abroad.
Now, I try to think back because we had the pleasure of inviting you into the regular The Smart EE podcast a while ago. I think it was more than a year. I think I remember that there still was some homework to be done for Brazil to make it an attractive market for new market entrants. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what are the business opportunities now as we speak?
So, Brazil, when you look at the Brazilian electricity sector, that's a sector that has traditionally received quite a significant influx of long-term foreign investments. You have companies like ENGIE, Enel, EGP, Statkraft, Three Gorges, etc., providing, long-term funds for energy generation projects. And I think this will continue. So when speaking specifically about opportunities with respect to hydrogen and energy storage, there is a need, and I should maybe say also a certain art of doing clever project development at this point in time. This is being done both by domestic companies, this is being done by international project developers. So there's definitely a huge opportunity there. And maybe we can also talk a little bit about the capacity market, which is also another interesting application. When it comes to really, installing stuff and getting projects on the ground, there is also quite a robust local EPC sector, so engineering, procurement, construction companies. But again, the components more often than not will come from abroad.
Well, then let's talk about the capacity market.
Let's do that. So this is actually something that exists in various countries. We have that in the UK, in Australia, in Italy, US, etc. And basically the idea behind the capacity market really is to have kind of reserve power for moments when the electricity grid is stressed out. Basically you have peak loads, you are facing the risk that your current generation will not be able to meet that demand. And so basically you have kind of your standby power plants. Traditionally, this is something that has been provided by gas. Gas is kind of the classic source for providing reserve power. Depending on the technology, you can fire up a gas plant fairly quickly, i.e., 30 minutes, 60 minutes, something like that, sometimes even shorter. And what we see in places like the UK, for example, I think UK is an interesting example, is to say, hey, if I need a 3 to 4 hour reserve capacity, why should I fire up a thermal power plant? I can dispatch batteries. Those could be centralized batteries. Those could be decentralized behind the meter batteries. And I could even couple those with renewable generation, because if my reserve capacity arises during the day or at night when there is a lot of wind, I could also take advantage of renewable generation. And so in the case of Brazil, for example, we foresee the need to contract something between 20 and 25 gigawatts of reserve capacity within the next couple of years. Traditionally, this is something that has only been open to gas, basically, gas and hydro. And the interesting thing of using batteries for that is the following. Brazil is still, quite dependent on hydro generation. 60% of the power still comes from hydro. What we have seen during the last years is an increasing variation of rainfall patterns. So we have some great years, like it was last year. We have some pretty dry years, like 21. And obviously this reflects on the ability to generate electricity out of hydropower. So especially for those drier years, we need reserve capacity that is cost competitive, because switching on a thermal power plant is expensive, not to speak of the ESG impact. So this is really cool. I think it's really an exciting opportunity.
Now, if we talk about that use case, we're talking about large-scale energy storage, yes, connected to solar, wind, or even hydropower plants. So if that's the one use case, on the other side, we have the small-size systems for decentralized generation. What of the two really is the future, or how much of the future share will they have?
Quite frankly, I think we will need both. In terms of share, it really depends on a couple of choices that right now are in the hands of the federal government. Reserve capacity is also contracted through auctions, like in the UK, for example. And those auctions are big. So, for example, the last auction took place in 21. and contracted 4 gigawatts. And this is kind of a binary situation. So if we have this change in the rules, if storage plus renewable sources can participate, then from today to tomorrow, you suddenly have a huge market opening up, and then centralized large-scale storage most likely will become the dominant application, like we see it in Chile, where we already see large-scale storage being coupled to power generation. Nonetheless, off-grid is very relevant when we talk about decarbonizing those locations in the Amazon. We are talking, not in all cases, but in certain cases, we are talking about 10, 20, 30 megawatt peak solar, 30, 50 megawatt hours of storage for some of the larger towns that we have there. So there are large opportunities there. We'll need a mix, and at the end of the day, it will be also a question of policy and of price development, quite frankly, in terms of where we can get and which sector will become the most important one.
Now, we started out with a specific European agenda when talking about Brazil. We took a really deep dive into all the domestic policies and developments, which was great. Now, being here at the Smarter E Europe, let's close again with the European interest. Having, of course, massive resources, South America is largely described as the source for lithium worldwide. Do you see any kind of opportunities to be more than just the raw material supplier?
This is a question that, regularly is being discussed in Brazil as well, and I'm sure in Chile it's not that different. So just for context, globally we have something around 80 million tons of known lithium reserves. Out of those 80, 20 are located in Bolivia, 17 in Argentina, and roughly 9 to 10 in Chile. So we are really talking about kind of a lithium triangle in South America. The point is, we need to look at all the steps that basically take us from the extraction of the raw material to a functioning battery cells. And so we are talking about, the processing step, which is basically, refining the lithium and turning it into something that you can use, like lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide. Today, we have something around 5 companies that control 75% of the market. None of those are located in South America. Most of them are in Asia and in China. Then you talk about producing the components of the cell, so basically the cathode and the anode. Again, a highly concentrated market, handful of companies, most of them being located in Asia. And then you have the cell manufacturing in itself and the integration of those cells into a functioning energy storage system. So could South American companies or countries, gain a share of that value chain? In principle, yes. You would have to embrace the technology. You would have to make massive investments to achieve scale. And in order to justify those massive investments, you need 2 things. You need to stimulate local demand, and you need to provide adequate funding for those kind of things. And when we talk about local demand, we talk about all those different applications. When we talk about long-term funding, we're talking about possibly, local or international development banks getting involved.
What are we talking about in terms of having really the research capabilities, the necessary talent, etc., to really actually build those companies?
You definitely need both of those, but I still believe that the critical factor is justifying those investments because, let's face it, when you talk about lithium refining, you're talking about multi-billion-dollar plants, and you need to have good reasons to justify setting up a local plant if you already have such a competitive global, supply chain. So what I believe is what we should be looking at in South America is at the further down steps of that value chain. Because, even if you assume that your battery cell will be coming from Asia, there are very, worthwhile opportunities further down the value stream. You should, by all means, think about doing the physical and technical integration of those cells into a functioning energy storage system locally. You should thinking about strengthening local engineering, local software development, local installation. So I think right now we are kind of by default strong on the raw material side. I think we need to strengthen all of the system integration and downstream activities, because with that you also serve directly the local market. And to which extent the refining and processing of those local materials can be localized, to be honest, remains to be seen. I think realistically, it's a bit of an uphill battle.
So that's really something we'll probably still be talking about in the future episodes in 2, 3 or 5 years even. Really looking forward to inviting you back again in some time. That was really a massive deep dive into all sorts of various topics. So amazing to have somebody here on the table who's so knowledgeable in all of these facts and figures. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking again next time, and hopefully about, already talking about large-scale projects being implemented.
And having said that, I know there's also the Smarter E Brazil. What actually made you travel all the way from Brazil to join us here at the Smarter E Europe?
We really see that European markets are at the forefront of things that are yet to come in South America. When we talk about, the different, both large-scale and smaller-scale applications of energy storage, those are already, happening in Europe right now. We really see very exciting new technologies being rolled out, talking about sodium-ion batteries, talking about flow batteries, etc. So I think when your home turf is South America, you need to be looking outwards, both to Europe and to North America, to learn from the things that have worked well, from the things that have not worked that well, and reflect on how that is applicable to your domestic market. Brazil normally is not an early mover when it comes to those things. We saw that in solar, we saw that in wind, and we're seeing it now in storage. But when the market happens, it takes off very, very quickly. In solar, for example, Brazil within 5 years went from 0 to more than 30 gigawatts installed capacity. I have no doubts that will be happening in storage as well. Chile we're already kind of seeing that inflection point happening. So you need to be kind of connected, right? You need to be seeing what works and what does not work and what we can learn from the stuff that's happening here in Europe.
So thanks a lot for traveling all the way and joining us here, and all the best for more developments in Brazil.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be around.
This already was the 3rd episode of our special mini-series recorded live at the Smarter E Europe in June in Munich. After this, we'll return to the regular podcast for 1 episode and then be back for 3 more interviews that I had live at the Smarter E Europe. So stay with us. For example, for the 4th part of our mini-series, I sat down with Nam Tuang, founder and managing director of Stable. Not only did we talk about their new storage system using second life batteries and coming along with a subscription-based model, but more specifically, we spoke about their innovative inverter technology. So stay tuned.